Thank you, Venky. I mean, it's a privilege for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to a great discussion, just as one of your newsletters.
Very glad. So, before we really kickstart the topic in hand, who's Shubham?
Wow, that's philosophical. I mean, we've gone into the desert in Gujarat to answer that question, and I'll give some context on that. But okay, so let me introduce myself. As of now, I work as a managing director at Syngenta Ventures, which is the corporate venture capital unit of Syngenta Corporation, a job that I've been doing for 3 years and enjoying a lot. Prior to this, I had 2 years in the Syngenta strategy team,
Mm-hmm.
which is where I had joined the organization in 2014. So I'm based in Basel, Switzerland, which is the
Mm-hmm.
company's headquarter.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to this, I was in India, and I had 8 years of consulting, combination of BCG and AT Kearney.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I would say a very standard Indian education path of engineer plus MBA. So IMA graduate of 2006, IIT Delhi graduate of 2004. um, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in Who is Shubhang, I have, I live here with my family. So my wife and one 8-year old. And yeah, that I think that would define me.
Wonderful, wonderful. The first thing that really struck me in when I read your article is the kind of the dramaticness of it.
Hmm.
Because coming from a venture capitalist, and you really uh, it was really heartening for me to see the level of candor that was happening in terms of admitting that the gods have failed,
Hmm.
right? I mean, as you framed it. So, just to give the context for the viewers who are watching this, I started sort of following Shubhang's writings primarily when after I stumbled upon this article that was recommended by a few other venture capitalists to me, and what I really liked was in terms of an honest assessment of where Agtech in the 2000 as it started and where it is currently now. So, what led you to write this piece, Shubham?
Yeah. Thank you, Venki. Firstly, thank you for reading it, and thank you for highlighting it. It's amazing the kind of conversations I've had subsequent to that article. But to answer your question, you know, I wish I had a nice story to tell you that I was sitting on my desk and the gods of inspiration decided to favor me, and I knew exactly what I had to write. But unfortunately, it's not like that. It All of this started, as many good things do, over
Mm-hmm.
a drunken hangover. Not mine, but a colleague of mine who's no longer in Agtech Venture Capital, and who's now become a generalist VC. I caught up with him, and he told me something. He said that, look, I will never invest in Agtech. And that
Mm-hmm.
was a bit of a surprise to me, because this person had been part of an Agtech investing unit for the best part of 5 years. So I asked him why, and the last thing he said before he passed out was, because it sucks. Now I don't obviously agree with all of that, but it did you know send me into this mode of introspection, that why is this person who, when he's not drunk, is reasonably quite reasonable in his thinking, why would he say this?
Mm-hmm.
And he said this because he was comparing ag tech to some other sectors of technology. And essentially I really started thinking to myself, look, there is some genuine truth to what is being said over here. Let's try and dispassionately and analytically try and understand where we are. And I would say this is where a little bit of the consultant kicks in. You can take a consultant out of a consulting firm, but you never take the consulting firm out of a consultant. So I really wanted to arrive at some kind of an analytical answer. And I started off with a very standard fishbone diagram, saying, okay, ag tech has been disappointing. why. So I started listing around things, started listing down things. So subsequently, that evolved, and it continues to evolve. But really, that was the genesis of my article, because I realized that there are some deep rooted issues that could lead people to say that the promise of technology in agriculture and the promise of venture capital in agriculture has not been realized in the last decade. So that's the genesis.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, what really caught my attention in that piece is the fact that you talked very interestingly about this foie gras mindset.
Mhm.
Because today, we hear these really fanciful narratives of Silicon Valley trying to look at agri-tech as a last bastion of digitalization, right?
Exactly.
We talk about Elon Musk brother getting into farming, and all these people have these very fancy ideas that you throw some machine learning and throw some technology, and you're going to solve these problems.
Mm.
So, what exactly is this foie gras mindset?
Yeah. Let me answer your question in a slightly different way, but I will get to all of this.
Sure.
I would like to maybe just situate my article in a certain context, and this is based on a lot of feedback that I have got on what I wrote, in the comments on LinkedIn itself, in email discussions, in person to person discussions. I think many people agreed, many disagreed, and that's always good, because it isn't, if you have uniformity, then you've written something that is absolutely bland. Many, I think, misunderstood the intent of the article, and a
Hmm.
very, very small minority felt that I was being too harsh, whatever that means. So I would like to, situate the article in its proper context, the way I intended it to come through. And I think the article in itself, its philosophy, emanates from, let me call them, the three negations, or the three elements of skepticism that characterized my view of Agtech in the 2010s. Firstly, I think the one thread that runs through my article is, does disruption happen at the high end or the low end, or can disruption happen at the high end at all? So that would be one. That is, what is perhaps legitimately characterized as the Elon Musk versus Clayton Christensen debate.
Hmm.
The second point was very similar to what you mentioned. Does technology and technology adoption exist in independent of the economic and social context, of the sector in which it operates? So, can you have infinite technology adoption without really caring about some of the other things?
Hmm.
This is it may sound pretentious, but this is, I would say, the Marx versus Weber view of the economy. So do people think about their economic condition separately, or are economic considerations, bundled with how you see your position in society? The
Hmm.
third piece is, again, very similar. uh, is technology a panacea, or a silver bullet, or a cure all for all the problems of agriculture? And maybe, if you don't mind, I'll just take a couple of minutes to go through each
Sure.
and every one of these. So let me start off with the idea: does disruption have happen at the high end at all? I think, as I mentioned there, disruption is a much abused, misused, and misunderstood term, and I certainly did not understand it, I have to say, before I got into writing this article. Um, the qu- there are two schools of thought. The Elon Musk school of thought is that technology, innovation, and adoption must happen at the high end first, and then you achieve economies of scale, the costs keep going down, and then it trickles down into the lower segments
Hmm.
of any industry. On the other hand, Clayton Christensen says all of these are sustaining or marginal innovations. True disruption can only happen at the low end. You take very, very simple technology,
Hmm.
but use it to address problems of an overlooked segment. And in this case, let's say smallholder farms, or the non-technified farmers would be that segment. So I
Hmm.
think the question is, if we talk about disruption, what would be really disruptive? Is uh, you know e-commerce for smallholders true disruption, or is hyperspectral drone imagery through disruption. And we can get into that in more detail, but the only point I would leave over there is, to some people it might seem like splitting hairs. It may seem like controversies in 5th century Byzantine Empire, or whether Jesus has two natures which are separate, or does Jesus have two natures that are intermingled. And you may say that it doesn't really matter. Well, just like the debates over the nature of Jesus led to a lot of bloodshed, I think the idea of whether Agtech is disruptive or not definitely feeds into the way the innovation ecosystem is shaping up, the way entrepreneurs look at the market, and the way the venture capital industry looks at the market. And I think real world consequences. The second point, does tech exist independent of its economic or social environment? And I think uh, this thread is also present when I say that the implicit assumption in agtech in the 2010s, and certainly in the west, was exactly as you mentioned, that create the technology, and a market, and a need, and a customer will come in by automatically. And the more I am exposed to the space, the less convinced I am by that view. And the problem is that I think, um, just as there are debates about what is the true nature of man, I mean, what is true human nature, everybody creates human nature as per their perceptions. The Silicon Valley man, exists to consume technology. I mean, Silicon Valley and the whole promise of technology is based on the idea that technology is an absolute good in itself. You can never have too much of it, and we must always strive for more, more, more. And the more I read about technology all through history, I realize that there have been, technology can remain dormant for centuries before the conditions align for its adoption. And the best example, and the most stark example I always give, is steam technology. So,
Mhm.
steam technology is what powered the Industrial Revolution. But if you speak to historians, they will say that the principles on which the first steam engine was made were known to the ancient Greeks and certainly the Romans. So why did the Greeks and the Romans not have an industrial revolution? There was not really much advance in mathematics. The level of human development as measured by per capita was not strikingly different. So how did the industrial revolution happen in some conditions and not in the others? Now, to translate that to farming, I think the Silicon Valley farmer is created in the image of the Silicon Valley entrepreneur. So the Silicon Valley entrepreneur also believes that the farmer exists only to absorb technology, and the problems that the farmers face are because they do not have enough technology. And this is now linked to the third point that I would make. Um, I think there is an element of naivety and
Mhm.
maybe some element of patronizingness, if that is a noun, in the way technologists look at farming. I think the belief is that, almost every pitch deck starts off with, we need to feed 9 billion people by 2050.
Don't
Yes.
tell me. It's most cliched and
Yeah.
the most yeah. It really grates my nerves whenever I read that.
Yeah, I
Tell
think
me about
after
it.
saying it for the 10th time, it does. But I think uh, the question the question to be asked is, yes, the world food and agri system is beset with problems. It needs to change, but I think the problems are much broader than technology. And I think we are in danger of the industry, and perhaps even more seriously policymakers, looking at technology as a weapon of mass distraction, as as a way of avoiding the really hard discussions we need to have on the policy environment, the economic environment in which farmers operate. I think farmers have genuine problems around market access, around the way they get access to credit, around the way that the global trading system is set up, around the way in which mechanisms of value share are set up, around the way in which government interventions and regulations are set up. I think my biggest worry is that ag tech, by promising a silver bullet solution, stops us from having hard and important conversations around these factors. And Venki, you mentioned that you will talk and write about the farm bill in the future. I think there is a rail roko from farmers planned on the 25th or 26th. My only question is, how many hyperspectral drone cameras would it need to satisfy those farmers?
No,
None,
so
right? Because that's not
mm,
what that's not what they're agitating against. So I think there is an element of humility required, but there's also an element of watchfulness required. That the problems of ag are multifaceted, and we need some hard, mature conversations around them. And there's no getting away with that with the hope that technology will be the solution. So ultimately, what I like to say is, technology is the new God. Today, you cannot have blind faith in God, you will get laughed out. But it is possible to have blind faith in technology, because at the end of the day, we all want to have a better future. God doesn't seem to promise it, so maybe we should repose our faith in technology. So that's where I'll leave it.
sure. No, there are two things that very I find very strikingly interesting. One is the idea of placing tech. I mean, since you talked about steam engines, so I'm also going to get in a slightly philosophical mode, right?
Sure.
Primarily, we like to think of technology as acontextual,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And there is also a very fallacious assumption that the marginal cost of serving the farmer is going, because you have the aggregation theory which says that the marginal cost of serving an additional person is going to be zero. So we
Yeah,
conflate the same thing in agriculture, right?
yeah,
And we assume that marginal cost of serving an additional farmer is also going to be in almost zero, right?
yes.
So that is one aspect. The second aspect that I also find very interesting is, today we partly the whole logic about you talked about the steam engine, right? Today, even for the fact that like I meet with various startups, and most of the startups almost pretty much do the MVP on a WhatsApp,
Mm,
you know.
yep.
And even you see this historically also, that you if you take the case of say in Japan, even after when the guns were invented, the samurai monks still went ahead with the sword, you know. So pretty much context plays a role in the way the technology is evolving in. And we could, just because we have this fallacious understanding of where the marginal cost is, we tend to assume that it's going to be zero and he's just going to drink in the technology that is poured by the saviors.
Yep, exactly. Absolutely. I mean, I think you've hit it on the head. I think this idea that the marginal cost of serving the next farmer is zero, it comes from our theories of industrial economics, and industries are concentrated places. So yes, that does hold true. I mean, if you're producing, I don't know, one widget, then the next widget doesn't take that much cost to produce. But farming is different. I mean, farming is disaggregated. So even if you have served, let's say, 1000 farmers in one district, if you have to serve the farmer in the next district, you need to basically take your setup and go over there. And let's talk for the moment of something around operations. So the understanding and the economics on which the marginal cost theory is based was based on the collection and concentration of economic activity in one location, whereas agriculture, being geographically and spatially dispersed, it violates some of those fundamental axioms. But you know we are so conditioned to look at things from that perspective that you mentioned, that we I think it takes a long time before you realize that farming is different. That perhaps comes to the next element of maybe being introspective here. um, the f- Technology is being injected into farming by a segment of people who are not farmers themselves, and who have historically come from a stratum of society uh, which has actively tried to get away from farming. And let's put it this way. I mean, uh, for the last 100 and 150 years, the story of urbanization has been that people would try to leave villages, try to leave farming, and adopt new modes of existence. So all of a sudden you have engineers, you have entrepreneurs, and you have very educated people who now think that they have enough knowledge that they should project some technology back. But we have lost all linkage in the way we've grown up with farming. We don't understand the village, and we don't and I hold myself as much an example of this as anybody else. I mean, I am three generations removed from my family's origins in farming. So the we went my family went from a small village to a medium-sized town to a big town, and now somehow I'm here in Basel. So I am so divorced from the context in which village and rural life happens in India, that when I started working for Syngenta, and I started talking to startups, and I started visiting a few farmers, I realized that some of the assumptions I carried in my mind, that a village is a slightly poorer town, or a village is a slightly greener town, or a village is a town where the people just basically grow their own vegetables. That's not really true. I mean, a village is a society, it's an ecosystem by itself. Social relationships are important. The way people look at their existence is different. And that was really uh, something which made me very, very humble, that at the age of 35 I realized I have no clue about how 65% of the Indian population lives. So I also come at this topic from an element of humility, and an element of trying to cut down some of the patronizing views that urbanites like us may have, or at least urbanites like I certainly perhaps have had, that the rural hinterland exists for us to act like saviors and bring technology to them, independent of any context.
Yeah, I mean, it's triggering multiple thoughts there. So one is like, I'll be honest here. I've hated this whole theory of bottom of the pyramid.
Mm.
It probably comes, it ranks in a 7.5 Richter scale in my hateness score. Primarily because it is very classic of that kind of a mindset, right? You want to sell shampoos, you want to
Yeah.
sell shampoo, you give them a sachet. It reeks of that patronizing mindset.
Yeah.
And the other aspect is, we all have lost connection with this roots. Like I come from a second generation where my great grandfather, was an agriculturist. He ran a rice mill, and he was also one of the first person to set the primary agricultural credit society in Tamil Nadu.
Uh-huh. Mm.
And he wrote this beautiful. I mean, if you give me a minute to just talk about
Sure.
reminisce about my great grandfather's history, he wrote this beautiful book called Farming Guide in 1908,
Wow.
and it was published, and it was written with all forwards written by all the divans and all the divan bahadurs of the British era. And interestingly, there was no copy left in my family, and the only copy I could find was in London Museum.
Wow. I mean, I think you could pretty much summarize my 10 minutes with exactly that story. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And I mean, I'll coming back to this discussion. What really another point that really interested me is the startups who are beginning to look like the traditional players. Like
Mhm.
today, I mean, I'll be politically incorrect and name that when I look at some of the agri e-commerce players, of the likes of say AgroStar or any other players, they pretty much start to resemble the traditional distributors or the
Mm.
traditional retailers and the players. And you really point out that point in terms of that we've not innovated in the business models, right? We have not seen new business models. Why is that? You think that has not happened so far?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. Maybe I can answer that a little bit more from the perspective of the US and Europe, which is
Sure.
where I'm based right now, and which provide the context with which many of the things in the article were written. Firstly, I think yes, you're absolutely right. I think the idea that startups start off with an insurgent mission and then start looking more and more like the incumbent industry. It's a very powerful realization. And if you think that's happening in India, I think you can imagine that and multiply it tenfold why with what's happening in the US and what's happening in Western Europe. I think, and this is just a hypothesis, I think the reason for that is not straightforward, but here's my hypothesis, here's a conjecture. I think we're accustomed to seeing humanity divided into and economies divided into nations, which are absolutely artificial constructs. But we think of the farmers of the USA as existing only within the United States of America. But if for a moment you were to look at farmers as a global class, because let's say all of them feed into a single commodity, global commodity market, which is not true, but for the sake of a simplification, let's try that. Then what you realize is that a lot of these funds and a lot of the startup venture capital energy for the last 10 years actually went for a very small sliver of farmers. And this is the most technified and the most uh, already efficient farmers in the world. And now this is where I'd like to come back to the point I said about, does disruption really happen at the high end? So the technified farmer in the US and Western Europe is the traditional domain, is the segment that has been served by the existing agribusiness, let's say the incumbent industry. And one of the theories which says that disruption cannot happen at the high end says that the reason why disruption doesn't happen at the high end is because the highest end is already being served by customers, by the incumbents. It is the most profitable segment for the incumbents. So the incumbents are already putting in resources to try and address their needs.
Mhm.
So the startups are trying to fight for the very same customer segment, and they are coming up against a legacy industrial structure, which is difficult to shake off. So if they are not to perish, if they are to fight for the same segment of farmers, they need to become more and more like the existing club of industry. So the fact that they are becoming more and more like the incumbents, I think, is explained by this explanation that they we technology so far is hyper concentrated on a relatively small segment of the overall farming base.
Mm.
If, for example, had to see, you want if there was something truly disruptive, what we would see is underserved segments of farmers, those which are neglected by the traditional industry, or those which the traditional industry cannot serve except at a very high cost. Somebody would cobble together a good enough solution, start becoming mass, and start driving down their own costs, start learning, and then start challenging the incumbents themselves. The other point I think you mentioned is, why have there been no new business models? It's a great question, and it's something that I don't think I have a very good answer. But one of the comments that came under my article was, why does the outsourced discovery model work in pharma and not in agriculture? And the
Mm.
only answer I can give is that in the ag industry, if within the incumbents you have, yeah, a large number of scientists and R&D being done in house. So basically you have extremely smart and extremely talented scientists and engineers employed within the majors, also in the startup industry. So essentially you have the same kind of people duplicating efforts. So startups are playing a game whose rules have already been set, and whether consciously or unconsciously, they are not trying to address any of the existing rules by which the game is played. And so I think the natural outcome of this is they start having to look more and more like incumbents.
Hmm. No, I mean, what you're saying with US, I see it related with the Indian context, right? Today, just like you said, that there's a very tiny sliver of people who are being served by technology. In India, I can tell you from the work experience I have been doing with work in the agri input context, pretty much all technologies are targeted towards the so-called progressive farmers.
Yep.
They
The
have this
high margin farmers.
moniker.
Let's just call them high margin
Yeah,
farmers. Yeah.
it's a moniker that is so utterly disrespectful of farmers and their intelligence. I mean, personally speaking, uh, but yeah, that's pretty much the case, in even in Indian context there. But coming to a point that you mentioned about the why the outsourced farmer, I mean, I want to move into a slightly technical part there. Question here. I mean, I find the point interesting in terms of what he's saying, that outsourced R&D, which in the pharma context doesn't work in agriculture. One thing that I have seen over time is the active ingredients over time is coming down, right? So, and obviously, and so which means also that the number of time it takes for for an R&D, for new active ingredient to come into the market and go through all the trials and then come out of the market, that cost is also increasing.
Yep.
So, are we
Absolutely.
seeing a trend where the R&Ds are evolving to a new paradigm that has got less to do with coming up with a newer active ingredient, or is that a larger trend that we are seeing?
Yeah. I think it's difficult to answer this, but let me step back, and I think in some ways the the in some ways I think the problem is that the incumbent industry is actually, and this people may find hard to believe or agree with me, but I hold on to this view sincerely, is actually a very very efficient industry, in the sense that you know the advancements in technology have
Mhm.
allowed the world to eliminate, to a great extent, large scale starvation, large scale hunger, and basically make sure that food production keeps pace with population growth over the last 70 years.
Mm.
And the reason, you you, you probably don't need to go back further than your grandparents, but perhaps even your parents. They would tell you that in the 1960s, India had to import PL 480 shipments and grain from the US. When I was growing up, my mother, used to always tell me about that, this happened, and she would always say that with a sense of shame, because she said that, look, in the 1960s, in 66, we were facing a famine. We had to import grains from the USA, and she said this is food that was reject grade for feeding to
Correct.
cows and horses. Now, from that element, to come to a situation in India, and again, I'm not trivializing the challenges that the food system has in India, but at least the yield, and the overall production side has been a remarkable success when you perhaps compare it to where we were in 1960s, and I think that holds true globally. So the incumbent industry has been extremely successful so far in delivering yield, and the food system that we had post 1945, I would say, was oriented solely towards yield. Now, I think there is a school of thought that believes that we may have achieved the limit of innovation and what is possible to deliver in terms of yield through purely R&D based approaches. So
Mhm.
we need a combination of science, chemistry, biology, digital technologies, economics to create the new food ecosystem, where the worry is not mass starvation, but the worry is economic impact of farming, sustainability, nutrition, the quality of food that goes in. So to answer your question, I think, you know, yes, there will be a paradigm shift in R&D, because I think perhaps we are plateauing in some of the R&D gains that we have traditionally seen. But I also think that the food and agri ecosystem of tomorrow has completely different requirements that need us that need different kind of innovation. Let's just put it there.
No, I mean, what you're saying reminds me of what E.F. Schumacher used to say, this British economist. I don't know if you've heard of E.F. Schumacher. Used to say that we treated nature as as income when it is capital,
Yeah.
right? And pretty much, I would attribute the. I mean, if I when I look back, the yield that increase that we had came from a fundamental misunderstanding of treating the soil as an income when it is a capital,
Yeah.
right? So perhaps that's, I mean, and that's a price we are right now paying with the desertification and
Yeah.
all the soil that is getting ruining back there, right? So in that case, so then pretty much the technologies that we are going to import, or let's say, because today, I was looking at this startup that is using these spectral imagery, and they also get in some data from IoT systems to track the soil, and they are pretty much imported it
Mm,
from France,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
This is one of the popular Indian agri startups. uh, so now pretty much then those kind of technology models perhaps will not work in an Indian context, right?
Yeah, and I think this comes back to the fact that technology is not a contextual. It works in certain contexts. I mean, again, this is, I think, the problem of having the Silicon Valley view, where technology is the Holy Spirit. It's an absolute good by itself. It's not the case. I mean, technology allows us to overcome constraints imposed by nature. Now, the natural constraints that exist in France may not be the same as the ones that you have in India. And let's not, why limit ourselves to natural constraints, the economic constraints, the regulatory environment that farmers find themselves in. So this the this idea that, and maybe there is an element of false equivalence here, that we believed that in the 60s we could take, hybrid varieties and innovation coming from universities in the US and transplant it over here. Firstly, that's not how it happened. There was significant indigenization and customization even of those technologies like high yielding varieties. But I I I I just think that, if you have a technology driven mindset, you believe that just like there was an Uber and there was an Amazon, which, grew out from Silicon Valley and could take over the whole world. Agtech is also very similar, that, it the ride hailing algorithm in San Francisco need not be all that different from the ride hailing algorithm in New Delhi. But that's not the case in agriculture. Agriculture is unique.
Yeah, we have 15 climate change, 15 climatic varieties here,
Climatic zones, yeah.
and obviously your algorithm, which is going to track your, let's say, measure or predict the yield, is going to
Mm,
be dependent on that local kind. I mean, and you see this pretty much in the in current startups, right? Today, what I see is some of the algorithms that are being built are very focused on a particular crop, which are more often an export oriented crop,
yep.
right?
Because
And
probably the economics justify
exactly.
only for an export oriented crop. Yeah.
Yeah. You see wine grapes of the Nashik belt. Now,
Hmm.
all the most of the innovations that are happening in soil sampling, in soil testing, or in yield predictions are all coming from that region, because there the farmers are ready to pay
Yeah. Yeah.
for a more defined yield. So
Exactly.
I'll
Maybe if I can, Venki,
sure.
just make one point. I mean, we've spent a lot of time thinking, talking about where Agtech has failed, but there are a couple of things that I would like to bring out, especially in emerging markets. The traditional innovation paradigm in the ag industry has been, global product level, level innovation. So,
Hmm.
there is centralized research in one or a few parts of the world to develop a product which can then be taken across and sold in multiple contexts. And, the crop protection industry is an example of that. What I think the traditional industry and the incumbent industry doesn't do is do market development. So we don't invest in, making the linkages, which would connect farmers to markets. We don't make the investments in, creating a credit ecosystem, etc. And when I look at what venture capital is doing in emerging markets, I think it is stepping in where, the incumbent industry has not stepped in, and where the state perhaps is too constrained to step in, which is by investing in creating, or let's say developing the market. So instead of investing in research or product research for global outcomes, venture capital is investing in market specific development to create local markets, which will eventually benefit the agri industry and hopefully will benefit the farmers as well. So I think that's actually a very commendable role that
mm,
this kind of financing plays. And I think that's a very commendable role that the entrepreneurs who are involved in agtech in India, in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in China, they play. I mean, uh, you know the big successes of venture capital and e-commerce and digitization in Asia, and certainly perhaps in India, have been broadly in urban pockets. I think Agritech, the use of technology in agriculture, is the first time that technology is being projected from the urban centers into the rural hinterland, and I think that's a very commendable job. It's something that has scared off, and people have failed to do that. But I was just looking at statistics. I think some $600 million of venture capital funding went into the Indian upstream ag sector, so not food delivery but creating these
mm,
market linkages. That is going to transform
mm,
agriculture in India in some shape or form. And the amount of investment, I mean, which I don't think the incumbent industry would have made India specific investments of that order of magnitude. I could be wrong, but
mm,
even if I'm wrong, then the extra bit helps. So I think the agtech industry is playing a good role in emerging markets. The problem is in the US and Europe, those linkages are already made. So
mm.
even over there, these startups need to fight with incumbents. But in India and other emerging markets, they're creating something that wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of the banana markets. I mean, I had this fascinating, again, a beer conversation with a banana farmer in Guatemala.
Hmm.
And he's a typical Indian. Whenever they meet an Indian, they want to talk about something India, right? So
Yep.
he is like, man, I like he said I'm almost very afraid of the Indian innovators who are there in the farming. And
Hmm.
that's the first thing he told me when this banana farmer was talking about India. So which tells me that in terms of as an anecdotal piece, the how much of amount of linkage that have happened in the banana space, right? And also it also, to your point that you were talking about in terms of product, like earlier we used to have a lot of talk around SRA institutes, but
Hmm.
today lot of these kind of market linkages have moved from the governmental moved and shift to the private, and
Yep.
pretty much we see this in the local different ecosystems and that have built in there. So
Yep.
which I think which is where your next part I wanted to talk about, which is like you almost like made a some kind of a prediction in your article, which is like agtech has failed and developed. I mean, if I were to reductively say it, agtech has failed in developed countries and in living up to its promise. The next big bet is in developing countries. So, from a venture capitalist perspective, can you unpack that in terms of what are the structural factors that drive your optimism?
Right. Let me start off answering this again in a because we're doing this informally in a sideways manner. I was reading something the other day, which said that in the 1950s, anthropological research looked at aboriginal tribes as primitives, and those are not terms that we would use today.
Mm,
But these were people who had not developed sufficiently to take control of the environment around them. And I read that the recent view of this has basically flipped 180 degrees,
mm,
where the tribes that we remain in aboriginal, or what we call as a primitive state, are actually tribes who are best suited to the environment in which they find themselves. So they're able to survive and succeed in the environment. So they never have this pressing need to use any kind of technology to over tame their environment because they're successful. So in that way, I think if you were to transpose this argument to agriculture, I see the biggest role of technology as an equalizer for um, you know inequities in distribution of any kind, whether it's capability, whether it's resources, whether it is whatever you like. So then the question becomes, where does technology have its most promise? Does it have in widening the gap between those who are already ahead and those who are far behind? In And that's what you see in agtech in the West. the farmers who are already very technified and already have the highest yield, they don't feel you know they would lose out anything by not adopting technology.
Hmm.
Whereas if you take technology and even simple technology to people, let's say, who are less technified, the gap and the benefits that you can bring are much higher. There is also the desire to adopt technology because those farmers know that they're back, they are not following best practices. So I think the promise of technology, from a philosophical perspective, I do believe lies in the developed markets more than in emerging markets. Then I think your what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
No, I mean, I was saying in terms of the your optimism towards developing
Ah,
countries in terms
yeah.
of the market space.
Yeah, I mean, whether it is optimism or whether it is just one of my colleagues who's not Indian. So he's a good counterbalance to my views, perhaps because all of us are unconsciously biased. I mean, he said that he sometimes feels that in the West or in the developed world, you have the problem of technologies looking for a problem to fix or something to
Hmm.
fix. Whereas when he says he looks at the emerging market landscape, he thinks that technologies can address existing problems, real problems, and valuable problems. And that's about it. Now, whether you would call it optimism, I would just say that there is a true performance gap
Hmm.
in the developing markets that technology can help address. And that's all there is. Whether that leads to success as defined in venture capital or in startup world, I don't know. But at least there is a problem to be solved. And I think at that level, we can all agree.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I see this in different aspect also. Like for instance, one of the observations that I've made in the past, and I've discussed this in other dialogues also, is like typically when we talk about bringing a technology, like
Mhm.
trickling down a technology from developed to developing countries, we
Yeah.
pretty much talk about not downscaling the technology, but upscaling the price so that
Yeah.
or upscaling the necessary the farmers or to have a economic scale. It's like I mean, the example that I often give is take the case of spraying services,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Today, after a lot of period of time, I'd say it was lately adopted in the agri input firms, at least in India,
Hmm.
in an Indian context, where they brought in those technology and then ensured that it was it is deployed and only in a certain economics of scale model, right? So the business models were brought in there, but it is not. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud, or maybe it's a fundamental limitation of the technology there. But there is no question of how do I downscale the technology to fit us a smaller marginal farmer, rather than aggregating the farmers to a certain group, and then ensuring
Hmm.
that these things work in scale.
Yeah. 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 I think I think that's a great that's a great point. I mean, I don't know how to answer that question with the exception of a let me try and address a couple of things. I think you know firstly, uh, within the gamut of problems to be solved, anything to do with operations, like let's say spraying, land preparation, harvesting, I see that as the most difficult problem for a startup to solve and solve at scale for a number of reasons. Firstly, that's where the geographic dispersion and the small scale nature of your customers comes and really hits you.
Hmm.
You cannot aggregate. I mean, you can't aggregate land, ask everybody to bring their land to a central location and then spray it, which would be easier for you. You have to go there and do this. And for agri businesses with their urban oriented locations and their cost structures, it becomes near impossible to do it. And I also have spoken to some startups which found it difficult to do that even with their low costs. And the reasons for this are, I think perhaps lie in the formal versus the informal economy. But at the end of the day, in an informal economy, one guy with a tractor, he can get somebody from the village and pay them a wage rather than a salary,
Hmm.
and do this on some scale. And uh, that entrepreneur or that operator is willing to live on the returns that they make, because he or she lives in a village. And the cost of living and the expectations in a village are different.
Hmm.
Those returns are not sufficient for perhaps somebody who's employed by a big firm, and even the startups have struggled to overcome that problem. So I think services is the most difficult thing to solve, even if you take out the context around labor laws, regulations, etc., etc.
Hmm.
I think it is much easier to have business models that involve some level of aggregation.
Hmm.
It could be aggregation on the offtake side, it could be aggregation on the input delivery side, it could be an aggregation on the lending side. But I think venture capital, technology, and the digital means that we see that have succeeded so much really do lend themselves to aggregation more than operations first. So if we're talking about an ecosystem being built, I think the way to build the ecosystem is to enter through those points of aggregation
Hmm.
and build up scale, presence, knowledge, and then perhaps get into operations. But I think it is exceptionally challenging to scale down, or to create operating models that work in certain parts of agriculture versus others.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I find that interesting. I mean, purely from an economic perspective, what you're saying is the transaction costs are high,
Yeah.
right? So, and that's where typically the allied ecosystem around farming has been built on, right?
Yes.
Today,
And it
large
is informal. A lot of it
informal,
is informal. Exactly.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
It exists for a reason.
Exactly.
Yes.
Which is now that we are all, the hot potato topic is the farming bills, and
The
everybody is
Artias. Yeah.
talking about eliminating arhatiyas or middlemen.
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't really understand the importance of this transaction cost,
Exactly.
and we almost assume that. Without taking any sides here, we almost assume that by removing a middleman, woof, we'll have a solution that can be solved, and an infrastructure also that can be built in there.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, firstly, I think, the problem of middlemen, and it sounds great in a pitch deck, but the problem of middlemen is almost presented in moral terms, that the middleman is an agent of evil and he has to be eliminated, and it's perhaps a sign of how we the urban people who make these pitch documents view the rural ecosystem, but we don't realize that that ecosystem has come up over many decades and it exists for a reason. And those artiyas, who in Bollywood, etc., are always the money sucking, blood sucking money lenders and all, and many of it is true, but they also play an important role
Hmm.
in the rural economies that they serve. They are there because of fundamentally the structure of our farming base. Our farmers do not have the scale to individually optimize their economics, so they are dependent on these artiyas to link them to the commercial world, and that is why they exist. Again, as you say, not taking any sides, but I think we should do well to move away from the moralization of this problem to looking at it from a dispassionate economic way.
Yeah, yeah. So we just have about next 30 minutes. So I thought
Sure.
I'll announce the audience that in case you want to ask any questions to Shubhang, now is the time. We'll go through the comments and see if we can address some of these questions there. But again, I also want to switch gears a little bit. Before we start receiving questions. Uh, Today, as an outsider, who is really looking at the Agtech ecosystem. I'm not an outsider in that technical sense, but somebody who is looking at the, let's say, let me frame it this way: as an Indian Agtech person who is looking at the US markets, one of the uh, one of the fascinating things that I'm observing is the whole disruption that is happening around what FBN is trying to do,
Hmm.
right? Which is because, at least to me, as I'm seeing it, it's perhaps it's the only uh, startup that is really trying to really pitch it as like a David versus Goliath battle. So how do you see it as in your personal way? I mean, in terms of, do you see that as really some kind of a disruption that would really upset the apple cart, or you think this is a startup narrative on steroids?
So I have some knowledge of FBN. I don't know them all that well, but
Hmm.
let me not talk about FBN, but let me talk by the on the general topic of e-commerce, or alternative ways to distribute inputs in developed markets. Again, I think if you come down classical disruption theory, you'd say that it cannot be disruptive, because
Hmm.
there none of these startups are serving, let's say, the underserved segments, and perhaps there are underserved segments even within the US. So if,
Hmm.
for example, there was a hypothetical e-commerce company that was purely online, and focused on serving only smallholders in the US context, who might be actually really big farms by the Indian context, but focused only on smallholders, then yes, you would that would be disruptive, because they would be serving segments that are unprofitable for the incumbent industry, and that's how they would create a new market.
Hmm.
Whereas I think some of the many of the startups are actually going for the same customers that the incumbent industry is also currently serving.
Hmm.
So is it true disruption, or is it increased competition? And I
Hmm.
think that's question number one.
Hmm.
um, both models, I think, exist in the US. Which way one falls versus the other, who knows? We shall see. The other point is that the US has a well established channel, and the channel doesn't sit around, and the incumbents don't sit around when they're threatened. So they will build their own capabilities, and so eventually will you have everybody converging to a mean kind of state. So everybody basically starts looking like each other. I don't know. I think the jury is out on much of e-commerce in the US. I don't know the FBN story in detail, but this is how I would look at the space.
No, I mean, I find it very fascinating because some of the agri-tech entrepreneurs I talk to in India are pretty much betting their long-term play on an FBN play model.
Mm.
Which is very interesting because that is to me, if you ask me, it is the disruption that could really happen, because ultimately
Yes.
we've seen this, that whenever exits come, it's pretty much, I mean, you also talked about it in the article, right, that exits are not really happening much for startups. And
Yeah.
that's because, I mean, and you could really, when you look at it from an agri input perspective, we know that the amount of consolidation that has happened in the agri input industry,
Yeah.
right? And so there are naturally, now there are only a handful of players, right? I mean, literally handful of players.
Yeah.
Which automatically brings to the point that obviously then the exits have to be lower, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so then the question comes to, in then what kind of exits can really happen, right? If your only target is like, I'm going to be acquired by an agri input company, then
Yeah.
obviously then your exit is going to be very limited.
Yeah. Well, I think your exit options, in the sense that the universe that may acquire you is limited. It seems limited for now, but
Mm.
there are many agri input providers, not just the traditional big four, big six, or the R&D driven input players, but there are many others, and many of them are trying to come up the value chain. So I think yes, but you're right. It's you don't have an infinite universe of acquirers. I think the second point is, and this is where I would come, acquisitions happen for a number of corporate reasons. It could be acqui-hire. So look, these
Mm.
guys are doing something cool. There are five people, let's just buy them very early. That's not a very valuable acquisition, but it is an exit. The
Yeah, it's a compromise
if
in some sense,
Yeah,
but yeah.
exactly. If I was a corporate, who would I want to acquire? I mean, I would want to acquire if somebody could give me access to customers that I don't have right now, or acquiring them would give me a big revenue boost.
Mm.
And what startup exists today, which would justify an inorganic acquisition case, that somebody could really see their business, their top line expand by taking an acquisition? Maybe 10 globally. I don't know. I mean, when I look at it, it seems to me that 80% of agtech companies globally would have revenues of less than $8 million, which
Mm.
is really not material for the business of most corporates. Where I think we keep coming back to this, but I think the what would be valuable for a corporate acquirer would be somebody who creates a market where there is none,
Mm,
or allows you to serve segments which are currently just so high cost to serve using the existing model, so that I could just buy somebody, bolt them on, and let them continue. So self-sustaining businesses at scale would be what would be acquired. Don't see too many of them on the landscape, but
mm,
at least in the emerging markets, because we know that there are large segments of customers, potential customers, who are left out of the incumbent industry. At least that's where you would start hunting potentially.
mm, mm,
Yes, I think you will continue to see acquisitions in the developed markets as well for purely technology perspective, but those would be to acquire technology at an early stage and bring it in house.
mm,
A bit like, perhaps, I think the best example of that is John Deere with Blue River Technology. I
mm,
mean, they
mm,
paid a reasonable premium. They acquired the company at a relatively early stage in its, at least the development stage was not complete. But they just said, this is such promising technology, we need to bring that in house. I think that's more of the exception than the norm, but that would be the other kind of technology driven exit that I could see, where you're doing something so different from the incumbent industry, but potentially so valuable that somebody just decides that, look, we need to acquire these guys. Those, I think, are the two most promising areas of exit.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, the point that what 80% in the 3 to 4 million bucket you were talking about, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
which is very interesting to me, because it's pretty much a logarithmic curve as we see in other industries, like where there are these
yeah.
three few or big four behemoths, and then followed by a long tail.
Long tail, yeah.
So I'll start with the questions there. So I think there's a question that is coming from Timanna Gowda. He's saying,
Mhm.
why we don't often see contract farming so much? I mean, he's also talked about as an FPOs as an alternative, but I'll stick to the first part of this question, that why we don't often see contract farming. Obviously, there are, in terms of reasons with respect to the legalities and how much of stakeholders there. But is there any other economical reason where we don't see them really kicking off as much as it should exist in theory?
I think I think you're much more of the expert on the Indian space. I think some beginnings or some experiments have been tied. My hypothesis around this is that, um, for contract farming, you need produce that probably satisfies output requirements within a relatively narrow band of
Mm,
attributes. So it can't be misshapen, it has to show some levels of consistency of quality. You need to make sure that it was grown in a certain manner, right kind of inputs were used, etc., etc., etc. I think it's just, uh, from an economic perspective, it is difficult to monitor that.
mhm,
And before the use of technology, I think it was probably impossible to monitor that, or you could only monitor that at a very, very high cost. Secondly, before somebody could do contract farming in a way that you could be assured of quality, you would need to do a lot of capability building. And I just don't think the contract farming offtake parties had the scale, ability, and resources to do that level of capability building.
mm,
Capability building for farming happens through academia, happens through the state. And the state is technically not an agency which is involved in contract farming. So they are not really you know um, training farmers to grow a certain within a narrow quality band that an off-taker would require. They just want them to be familiar with these inputs, these new technologies. So it's really injecting technology at the input side, but on the output side, there's nothing exists, I think, which can ensure quality. I think this was the problem till the recent past.
mhm.
How things change under the bill and how things change with new technologies, I have to admit I'm not qualified enough to answer that. So I'd actually be interested in hearing your views.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm also seeing some players who are now experimenting. I mean, I've talked earlier with people from the Bali world.
Mm,
for making beers, and also from some few folks from Cargill who also talked about some of the experiments they've done. Obviously, you've got PepsiCo that has been doing in there.
yeah,
But again, I think your point which you mentioned earlier, which in terms of market linkages, I think as they further build, we can probably see more such experiments happening
yeah,
now. Once the necessary safeguards are built in.
yeah,
I'll move on to the next question that is from Bailey, who talks about in 2020-30, what does your dream early stage food or ag company looks like?
yeah. Actually, I think Bailey, he's the founder CEO of Leaf,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
startup which just raised money. So, congratulations, Bailey, and thanks for listening in. Thanks for your question. Yeah, what does your dream early stage food ag company look like? Oh, wow. That was one question I was not prepared for. So, look, I think I'll come at this from two angles. One as a venture capitalist in a employed by a corporate, and then secondly as a corporate employee who happens to be working in venture capital. Um, I'd be really really excited by. Okay, this is a little bit of a personal view. I mean, I think there are three types of venture capitalists. There are people who go by the technology or product. There are people who go by their team, and there are people who are convinced by the market. So I fall in the bucket of those who believe that the market always wins.
Yeah,
So if you
I
could
was
have
just
a
pointing that tree to just to see if my
yes,
prediction was correct.
exactly. So I think you can have a great team and great product, but if the market simply doesn't need you, then like steam technology with the Greeks,
Hmm.
no team can win. So I am a big believer in trying to understand, are you solving a big problem for a real market need that already exists? And for me, uh, uh, a proxy for that would be your market uptake. What do your customers say about you? I mean, are they paying? I mean, it's one thing for people to say that I would pay for the service, but it's quite another for them to actually pay. So when you ask me what does your dream early stage food and ag company look like, let me answer in generalities. It would be solving a real problem, a big problem for a large number of farmers, potentially those who are overlooked by the incumbent industry. And it can happen through any combination of technologies. It can happen in any geographies. So I'm I don't have a thesis on technology. I don't have a thesis on geography per se, but I would like to see. I do believe that serving the underserved or the underbanked, that is a value. That's what a valuable startup does in my view.
Hmm. Is there a interesting story or an example that comes to your mind when it comes to technology that has identified a niche and serving the underserved? I mean, is there something from your, sort of your cabinet that you think like, I would really talk about this story that is it's a very interesting story that probably many people may not have heard of?
Yes, I mean, if you look at a lot of our portfolio companies, they do that in Agtech. So
Mm-hmm.
we're investors in NinjaCart. We're investors in another Turkish company called Tarfin, which is a fintech company. So let me take the example of fintech. I think, and the only reason I do this is because I did a course on the topic. Fintech emerged in the aftermath of the 2008-9 crash,
Mm-hmm.
when banks basically just, withdrew all sources of liquidity and capital. So all of a sudden, there was a huge number of people who wanted access to financing and credit, but couldn't get it from the traditional ecosystem, not because anything had fundamentally changed about their risk profile, their credit worthiness, or their ability to repay, but just because capital was not available. So that was the time, all these alternative lenders, all of the payday lenders started emerging. So this fintech innovation really happened in the on the margins of the established finance ecosystem, and they were serving the underserved. So people who needed a loan for a week, but till they got their paycheck, but for that they couldn't go to a bank. I mean, the transaction cost of going to a bank would be insane. So the when things stabilize, payday lenders like Wonga got a bad name, and eventually I think they had to go out of business. But in 2009, 10, 11, they were serving a real need. They were giving cash and liquidity to people who
Mm-hmm.
needed it and couldn't get it from any other source. Now, That's a little bit of our thesis around fintech in agriculture. The existing finance ecosystem does not do a great job in assessing the credit worthiness of farmers.
Mm.
In fact, it does such a poor job that agricultural financing is linked to collateral, or the possessions that a farmer has, rather than his ability to repay. And I just use the term his as a short as a quick
I
shortcut.
understand.
Yeah.
Understand.
um, so if you were to look at the farmer as a business, who uses inputs, has a manufacturing process, and then gets a payout at the end of the season, then you would assess them by seeing what crop are they growing, what is the size of their farm, what is the prevailing or the future price for a particular crop, etc., etc. And then you would have a cash flow based lending, and not a collateral based lending. So some of the most exciting examples, I think, of companies in agritech are companies that are doing exactly that. So
Mm.
they are identifying farmers who are not able to get credit from the established ecosystem, and trying to see, can you assess credit worthiness through an alternative mean, and then basically extend credit to them and get repaid at a cost that is feasible using digital technology.
Mm.
The recent investment that we did in Tarfin is exactly that. So
Interesting.
Darwin has real time point of sale financing for the purchase of inputs. A farmer goes into a retail store, says, I want to buy this. Can I get it? And then, based on the crop that they're growing, based on certain parameters, within 5 minutes, credit check is done and the loan is extended or not extended. So when you look at the as is situation, that farmer firstly would either not get access to any financing at all, or they would have to run around collecting documents, go to a bank, and then hope that they would be approved for a loan. When you contrast that to the 2b situation, where within 5 minutes, if you're a good credit risk, you get a loan, that's spectacular, and that's creating a market where none existed.
Hmm. No, but here's a contrarian thought. I mean,
Mhm.
the nearest analogy that I always think of when I look at fintech is it exists almost like the in the parallel art cinema movement.
Yep.
Like you always had the traditional Hollywood system, and you always had a parallel indie cinema movement. I mean, I'm a cine buff, so apologies for using the metaphor
Mm.
from there. But
So am I.
you always ensured that there is always this parallel ecosystem, and we've been talking about the parallel, becoming the new normal.
Yeah.
I know new normal is almost a bad phrase to use these days, but nevertheless,
At
uh,
least overused phrase, but yeah.
overuse space. Yes, is there always going to be this duality between this traditional system and these indie systems or parallel
Yep.
cinema systems that are
Yep.
exist in the fintech world? When would the card change?
I don't think it will ever change. I don't think it should change, because I think it's a dyad where one doesn't exist without the other. It's like good and evil. There is no absolute good, there is no absolute evil. Evil can only exist if you define what is good. So whatever is outside of it is evil. I think that's a little bit about fintech as well. I mean, the financial system is basically oriented towards stability, because if it if confidence, if there's no longer any confidence on checks being honored, or banks being able to give you deposits when you need it, then everybody withdraws their funds back and puts it under mattresses, etc. So the financial system historically has always treasured stability. The flip side of stability is that along with stability comes stagnation. There is no innovation without if you are aiming always for stability. So the finan and in for the interest of stability, the financial ecosystem, no matter how much it grows, it will always leave some people outside.
Hmm.
And that's where fintech will work. And fintech will extend lending, extend use innovative methods to assess credit worthiness, and basically finance people who are outside the net of the existing financial system.
Hmm.
They will then grow. and let's take the P2P lending industry or the microfinance industry always as examples. They will grow because there is demand. They will continue growing till they reach a certain stage, where they become a systemic risk to the full financial ecosystem. At that point, regulators will come in and say, now, the regulatory ecosystem extends to cover these entities as well. Then, the rate of profit will fall, etc., and they will become more and more like a regular bank. So that would be the new normal, and I think that's how innovation and advancement in the finance space in particular happens. So yes, you will have progressive increase of the net of regulation, but you know the reach of finance will always stop somewhere, and that is what will create the mechanism for other people and other models of lending. That's why village money lenders exist. They were not perhaps tech, but they were certainly fin for many years. So unless we reach a universal stage where everybody is happy and has no further wants and no further mismatch between income and outflow, I the finance ecosystem will always stop somewhere, and there will always be a place for financial transactions outside that system. So, and I think that holds true of everything, frankly. I mean, innovation really, in finance in particular, but in general, innovation can happens where the long arm of regulation stops by definition.
Mm. No, it's a classic S curve. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think it's a great point what you're mentioning there, because how do we then shorten the S curves and increase the Schumpeterian cycle?
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
creative destruction.
yeah, how do we
Yeah.
increase? That's the question there. I mean, and also, I mean, this problem is again very worth pondering about in an Indian context also, because today, almost like for several decades, we've been talking about farmers facing credit crunch,
Yep.
and RBI has put in the money, and we talk about different players coming in and out, but nobody has. I mean, at least from my observations over the last decade, there's not one single player who has come into the market and stabilized and has become a very dependable player when it comes to credit financing for farmers in Indian context.
I agree, but I think there is that innovation at the margins is happening.
Mm.
It is not at scale yet, agreed, but I think give it a few years. I think the innovative financing for farmers is actually a global problem. I mean, there is, you either have the traditional bank, or you have the village money lenders, and there's nothing really in the middle, and that holds true, I think, in the developing markets, or outside, basically places where the banking system does not have universal reach. I think banks are very good in terms of providing financing in the US and Western Europe, at least compared to the rest of the world. But in other geographies there is a need. I think people are only now starting to figure out models by which you can bank the unbanked or underbanked in developing markets. It'll take some time. I don't think there's anybody at scale yet, but I think it will happen. The good thing I think is that governments, regulators, and even the banking system do not really want to compete or stifle this kind of innovation. They really want somebody to succeed, so that banks can add one more profitable revenue line to themselves at some other point. Because ultimately banks, I think, are storehouses of capital. They would want to be in the business of lending and getting paid back. How they get paid back, so the dirty work of doing credit assessment, the dirty work of collections, they would not I don't think they want to get into that. So they'd be very happy if a bunch of young smart people come in and say, we have a tech solution for that. So I think it's actually open season. You can if you can solve this problem, then there's a lot of value to be created.
Yeah, I mean, talking of finance, the sun is setting in here in India, so it almost became a black and white frame here. So
Okay,
I had to
yeah, you
quickly
could
rush
see
in
that.
and turn
Yeah,
on the light there. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point there, because today we've been talking about. I mean, there are some very fascinating fintech startups in India that are coming in,
yeah,
which are talking about different models. That is, I mean, at one level, I see it is almost like a limitation that if you're only going to talk about data as underwriting the credit risk,
yeah,
you know
Yeah.
and we need to really think about newer models that can involve aggregation,
Yeah.
whether in context of P2P financing and different models there.
Yeah.
So so I think, yeah, I think it's an exciting time to see what can any new player come in and become an alternative, at least in the shorter run, to see.
Yeah, I think let's just put it this way. I think yes, there is a fintech story in India. I mean, there are huge fintech companies that have scaled in the past few years, but they are predominantly an urban story.
Yeah,
I think the rural fintech, perhaps the rural tech story, and definitely the rural fintech story still remains to be written. And I hope people will take inspiration from the models that have succeeded in the urban context in India and take them now. To the rural areas with the appropriate customization and the appropriate changes. But I think we're at the early stages of that journey. The reason why we don't see any big people at scale is because, well, it's still a period of innovation and experimentation. But at least I think that experimentation is happening, and who knows, in 5 years, 10 years, we could we could have a different conversation.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. So I'm also like, sending that, on this and that optimistic note. Say, so I think we've almost come to the end of the session. Then I don't want to stretch this further and test everyone's patience. Yeah, it's been a fantastic conversation, Shubhang. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciated the. Thank you really for taking this time. And any closing comments would you like to give in terms of the most hot pressing topic there, which is the
Absolutely not.
market.
All I'll say is I look forward to your next newsletter, and I'd like to thank everybody who was listening in, watching, and sending their questions. Really much appreciated. And once again, thank you, Venki, for giving me this opportunity. It's been fascinating to have been here today.
Yeah, so before we close the live stream, I just have one last question, and I
Sure.
realized that given the hot, sensitive nature of the issue with hand, it goes without saying that I must touch upon it there. So, what is
Sure.
your take on farm bills?
We could literally perhaps have an extra 1.5, well,
I know,
one
I
and a
know.
half days, not even a 1.5 hour session. So look, I mean, I have, firstly, I would admit that I don't know enough. I need to read a lot more. I think, again, let's we started at a philosophical note, so let's try and end at a philosophical note. I think this is a contest of two worldviews. There is one worldview which is, we'll call it the Adam Smith worldview, that human beings are naturally oriented and they would like to subject themselves to market forces. And you if you are not allowing human beings to be subject to market forces, you are holding them back, oppressing them, or keeping them away from their natural destiny. The other view is that the market is a very unnatural or an artificial mechanism, and most human beings do not want to be subject to the market. So I think this is a situation where there are the side which wants the market forces to come in is convinced that it's doing good, or doing the right thing, and there is another side which is genuinely worried about being subject to market forces. And I think the question is, it's really a question, it's really a contradiction between two worldviews. There is one belief that the market is the source of everything good, and there is another which is the market brings uncertainty, and we could end up in pauperization. I think both sides need to talk to each other, but I think till there is this realization that people are not clamoring to get market access, at least not without adequate safeguards. I think we need to I think both sides will be talking towards each other. And I think ultimately, there has been research around this, that sub throwing entire countries or groups of people to the market, as a cold turkey move, can sometimes be counterproductive, because people need some time to adjust. Their social safety nets do not react so fast. So I think the worry is that if you take away the protections that farmers have fought for, and there will always be questions, is this really a protection for a farmer or a middleman? I'm not getting into all of that, but there is a belief that there are things, that concessions or protections, that the rural constituency has won against the urban constituency, because political power in India is invested very strongly in people who have an urban background. They may still be able to get votes from the rural perspective, but we don't live in a peasant democracy. We live in a bourgeois middle class democracy, and I think it's a fascinating contest between two different worldviews. So to do justice to it, I think we need another session. But firstly, I look forward to reading your article about that.
So thank you. I think it's a great way of framing this and also bringing to a logical end. Because at the end of the day, market has given us both globalization and
Yep,
also the great inequality.
exactly.
So which one do
That's
you
the
pray for?
summary.
Which one do you curse for?
Exactly.
So I think on that note, I think it's a fantastic. I really loved this conversation, Shubhang,
My
and
pleasure.
it was something that was very instinctive that I was sort of sensing it from the way you'd written your article, and which led me to call you. And I am glad that I did. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for all those who chimed in. Some of the regulars I hear, Ashok and Timanna, and few new faces are also I see in here who have come in and been contributing to this discussion there. So we will meet again next week with a more interesting topic, and I will publish the article sometime on farming bills sooner. It's taking much longer than I thought, but yeah, because you considering the volatile, I'm also trying to see if I don't really mess it up. So yeah, so that will be soon, and yeah, look forward to having further more conversations, Shubham. Thank you so much. You have a
Absolutely,
great.
Venky. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.